So last but not least, please enjoy our workshop on how to use value-based pricing for growth, lessons from 8,342 companies by Patrick Campbell, the co-founder and CEO of Price Intelligently. Please give a big welcome.
Thank you very much. How's everyone doing? Last talk of the day. We ready to go get drinks? Is that no? Maybe? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me. As was mentioned, my name is Patrick Campbell. I'm the co-founder CEO of a company called Price Intelligently. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But just to get a feel for everyone who's in the room here, who here has been working on a company for more than 5 years? Anyone? More than 3 years? More than 1 year? Less than 6 months? Okay, some of you are lying to me at some point here, but I'll just assume that most of you are between 0 and 5 years, as that's just kind of the nature of the audience. But today, what I really want to kind of share and really want to talk about is what's happening in the market. And particularly not just in the US and also in the APAC region, but just globally when it comes not only to software, but also hardware and just technology in general. And in particular, if any of you have worked in business for any amount of time, even if it's less than a year, or if it's more than 20 years, the world has really, really changed in terms of how you can actually grow a business. And in particular, what we've noticed is that we now live in a world where acquisition as a main growth lever is actually dead. Now, I know that seems a little bit ironic because, of course, you need to acquire customers. It's really, really important to bring those customers on. But as you'll see a bit as we walk through some data, we're actually finding that in order to grow a company today, you can't just rely on acquiring customers. You have to be a lot better at not only monetizing those customers, AKA pricing those customers correctly, but you also need to be able to retain those customers through repeat purchases, as well as through maybe having some sort of a software element to your actual hardware product. So this is what we're going to unpack today. And in the first half of the presentation, we're going to actually support this with a ton of data. And then in the second half of the presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through a framework so you can do a lot of the research that Peter was talking about in terms of making sure that you're ready in that product market fit stage and you're not kind of bumbling around spending money that you don't have and end up failing because you didn't know your target customer. Does that sound good? Good? If you guys aren't on board, I'm not on board, okay? All right, cool. So just giving you a little bit of background, who in the world are we? So I run a company called Price Intelligently, and we have a number of different products. Not all of them are really important for this particular talk, but what's really kind of cool is that at this point in time, we've actually worked with about 25% of the entire software market, and of that, about 10% of them are both hardware, software, hybrid companies. And those percentages aren't necessarily the interesting fact here. The interesting fact here is that at this point, through our financial software as well as through our pricing software, we've actually seen inside more tech companies from a financial perspective than anyone else out there. Mentioned the number about 8,000. It's actually over 10,000 at this particular point. And the data that we have on these particular companies is very, very rich in terms of the actual financial workings of what works for growth and what doesn't work for growth. So we're going to be walking through a lot of the different data here to support that particular thesis and tell you why growth is changing so much so we can set you up for success, especially if you're a younger company, to make sure you're not making some of those mistakes that Peter was talking about. So let's unpack this thesis, as I mentioned, and then give you a framework to actually get over some of the problems that we're facing. So what I want to kind of talk about is the fact that if you were building a company 10, 15 years ago, you actually had a lot of leverage as a business. And the main reason is because there were a lot of technological burdens to actually starting a company. So if you were able to start that particular company, there weren't a lot of other people out there, especially if you were doing something in the technology space. But today, we don't have those technological moats as much as we did. So what we're finding now is that competition is rampant. And we actually went out and we talked to a bunch of different founders and a bunch of different executives, and we actually asked them, how many competitors did you have in the first year of doing business? And what we found is that 5 years ago, most people out there, they had just under 3 competitors, and that was in their first year of doing business. But today, what you're finding is that even if you start a business right out of the gate, you have nearly 10 different competitors. And what was fascinating about this is that when we actually talked to different founders and asked them how many different competitors they had today, the landscape actually looked like this. So all of a sudden, you went from starting a business with just 3 different competitors to having double-digit competitors across the board. And this is what gives you landscapes that look like this, right? So this is just marketing software, right? So it used to be there were only a couple of pieces of software out there to help you build your marketing, but today there's over 8,000 of them, and they do every little thing to help you actually grow your business. Now what's interesting about this is that with all of this kind of density in the market, both in software and in hardware, we've also had basically a drop-off in the number of marketing channels that have been out there. So if you were starting a company 10 years ago, you would get a brand new marketing channel almost every single quarter, if not every single year. So you had things like Google Ads, you had things like Facebook, all of a sudden all these different marketing channels were emerging. But as you'll notice today, when we talk to different founders about the number of marketing channels they have, we're noticing that we do now have more marketing channels than ever, but it's starting to level off, right? Now Instagram was kind of the next big marketing channel that we recently had, but before that, it was a few years before we had an Instagram level different marketing channel out there. And what's fascinating about this even further is that the scale of technology, the scale of hardware, the scale of software has given a lot of advantages to our customers. They've benefited immensely. And just to illustrate this, 10 years ago, it used to take over 57 hours to implement a piece of software or a piece of hardware into a business. Today, that same piece of software only takes about 7 hours. And what's interesting, if you kind of dig into this data even further, is that us as businesses, we have lost most of our power and most of our leverage on our customers, which we could argue is maybe a really, really good thing as consumers, but it's also a really, really bad thing for making a ton of money. And what we found is that customer acquisition costs is actually steadily increasing over time. So even though we have all of these marketing channels, and even though we have all of this kind of density out there, that density has actually increased CAC nearly 50% over the past 5 years. This means it's harder and harder to acquire customers, it's more expensive to acquire these customers, and even in the light of that, we've actually found that the relative value of features, the relative value of different products has actually declined while this increase of CAC is happening. So we went out and we asked nearly 1 million different consumers what their willingness to pay was for different products over the course of different years, the past few years. And what we found is that software that might have cost, let's say, $100, or hardware that might have cost $100 5 years ago is actually only worth about $30 today. And this is just the nature of there's just so much hardware, there's so much software out there, and ultimately it's something that's great for consumers, but it makes it really, really difficult for us to monetize as businesses because, of course, we want to be charging the rates that we were charging 5 years ago, but we just can't because the market doesn't bear it anymore. So what's interesting is that although everything is amazing, consumers are really, really ungrateful. So who here knows what NPS is? Net Promoter Score? All right, so it's a measure of customer satisfaction. If you've ever received a survey that says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend a particular product? That's an NPS score. And what we found is that over the past 5 years, NPS scores, or customer satisfaction scores, have actually declined pretty considerably. So 5 years ago, a customer might have been really, really satisfied or okay satisfied with a product at a score of about 34. That same customer today, the score is only about 10, and it's declining pretty rapidly even further. So basically, we're in this world where everything is amazing for customers, things are getting so much better, but it's becoming harder and harder for us to monetize, it's becoming harder and harder for us to grow our businesses. And what's really fascinating about this is that when we go on down a layer of actually looking at what we used to do as a business and what's actually working, we're finding that the old playbook of how we've grown our customers' bases and how we've grown our actual businesses is just no longer making the cut. So it used to be, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, that our playbook was to acquire, acquire, acquire. If you asked any business mentor out there what you could do to actually grow your business, it was all about acquiring more customers. And we actually went out and we talked to executives, we talked to mentors, we talked to founders, and we asked them if they could only do one thing in their business, acquire customers, monetize their customers, or retain their customers through repeat purchases, what we found is that most of them, it was all about acquiring customers. So the one thing that we wanted to do in our businesses was acquire as many customers as possible. which seems intuitive, right? You need customers to actually grow your business. But what's interesting is that when you look at the data, when you actually look at the growth data, whether it's from growth hackers or businesses that are actually doing really, really well, what you find is that acquisition is now table stakes. And what I mean by that is you just need to do good acquisition just to survive. So what we did is we isolated the impact of helping your acquisition, your monetization, and your retention. And we wanted to see which would have the highest impact given the same input. And so we found that if you improve your acquisition by about 1%, you're going to improve your bottom line, your revenue, by about 3%. This means if you bring in 1% more leads, or you bring in 1% better conversion volume, you're going to see about a 3% boost in your bottom line. But what's scary about this is that if we look at the data over time, we've actually noticed that this data has diminished, meaning now it's only about 2% boost in your bottom line versus the previous 3%. So what's interesting is that if we look at monetization and retention though, that same 1% of value that you're improving actually has much, much higher impact. So what this is saying is that if you focus that 1% of time that you were taking on acquisition on your monetization, AKA your pricing strategy, or on your retention, AKA your repeat purchase strategy in the hardware world, you would actually see 2 to 5x the impact of that same focus on acquisition. And very, very similarly to the drop that we've seen over time, we're actually increasing in the value of these two particular channels in your business. But remember, the big thing that we're doing is focusing all of our time, all of our effort over here, and in reality, this is what's working. Now, what's fascinating about this is if you dig further into this data, what you'll find is that it was okay to be very, very lazy about our customer research 5 to 10 years ago. Because there weren't a lot of competitors out there, there wasn't a lot of competition for marketing channels, it was okay to be a little bit lazy about who your actual customers were. But now as we've increased the technological advances, what we're finding is that you need to know your customer in order to succeed. You need to do the market research that Peter was talking about to make sure that you don't shoot yourself in the foot and all of a sudden end up not really being in business anymore. And so to illustrate this point, we have a lot of really, really good data, but it's a little bit of a different model that you probably haven't seen before. So I just want to walk through it here before we kind of jump into the data. And the model that we show is a really, really useful one in your business. It's a model to actually illustrate value. So when you think of value, there's 2 axes of value that you can kind of think about. And if you imagine a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or just something that you beverage that you drink, there's 2 different axes that you can actually think about when you're thinking about the value of that product. The first axis is the attributes. So is it the temperature, the taste, the brand, the country of origin of that particular cup of coffee? And we can illustrate that axis in particular on this x-axis here. The other axis of value is willingness to pay. So I can ask you about a cup of coffee, hey, do you care about the country of origin? Hey, do you care about the taste? And then I can also ask you, what's your willingness to pay for that particular cup of coffee? And I can illustrate that on this y-axis here. So if I have a cup of coffee and I find that I survey the whole group of you, and I find out that the majority of you really, really care about taste, and those who found taste that was really, really important, you're willing to pay more for that cup of coffee, then we have what's called a differentiable feature. Now, if I find, for instance, that a small majority of you really, really care about where that coffee came from, the country of origin, and those of you who care about that are willing to pay a lot for it, then we have an add-on. That's something that you can sell that isn't necessarily for everyone, but it's an add-on in your pricing strategy. Now, if I have something that's really, really important to everyone, but you're not willing to pay a lot more for it, then you have a core feature. And then my favorite quadrant, I call it trash land. If I have something that no one really, really cares about and no one's really willing to pay much for, you don't really have a good feature in general. So what we did with this quadrant is we actually went out and we talked to a bunch of product leaders. These were across hardware companies, software companies, just tons of different companies out there. And we actually asked them, for your past N features, where do you think they were on this particular quadrant? And being good product people, they were very, very confident in what they were building. And what we found is that this is where they thought all of their features were. This is where they actually placed the points on this particular map here. Now what we ended up doing is we then went out to 1.2 million of their customers, and we asked them very, very targeted questions to determine where these points actually were. And what we found is that this is where we're actually building products. So again, your product teams, a lot of you in particular, this is where you think you're building, and this is where it actually is. This is where you think you're building, where it actually is. I could do this all day. So I could just stand up here and go back and forth. And this is really, really painful when you're building hardware, right? Because it's not like software where you can just push some extra code, right? And it's really painful for software too. But given distribution, given logistics, this is a very, very expensive move to make. But we're all making it, and we're all really, really confident we're going in the right direction. And the reason that this is so painful is that there's really, really clear winners and very, very clear losers in this environment. When we break out companies that are doing customer research from companies that aren't doing customer research, what we typically find is that those companies that are doing customer research, that have a regular customer development process within their businesses, they are growing at a higher rate than those companies who aren't doing their research. And those of you who are very, very observant, you'll notice that this says 2012. And what's fascinating is that if we measure this data today, it's much, much worse. But what's unfortunate is that if we're really, really honest with ourselves, as companies, we're probably not doing the research. And that's because all of these different things come up. There's all these different distractions in actually building a business. And it's hurting us in the long run because we don't know what our customers want. And then eventually we don't know how to actually monetize those products as well. And what's really interesting as well is when we look at companies that are primarily focused on acquisition, this darker green, and we look at companies that have what we call balanced growth, meaning not only is their acquisition improving, but also their monetization and their repeat purchase rates, what we find is that those folks who have this balanced growth are growing at a much higher clip than those folks who are just focused on acquisition. And as you'll notice is that acquisition's power is actually diminishing over time because of all of those different factors that we talked about in the beginning of the presentation. And so this should be scary. And I know I'm like the bearer of bad news and I'm like a Debbie Downer, as they say. But the reason that this is so scary when you think about your business is that it doesn't matter if you're a software company, a hardware company, you're selling soda or coffee, everything that you do, from your acquisition strategy, your sales team, your marketing team, all the way down to your product team, your operations team, your finance team, what you are doing inside your business is you are driving a customer to a particular purchasing decision point, and then you are justifying that product or that price that you're offering them. And so if you don't know who this customer is, if you haven't done that customer research, then there's no way in hell you're gonna know what that product should be, or in reality, what that price should be. And that's painful. And too many of us, all we're doing is trying to acquire customers. Because the path of least resistance is, let me set up a new Facebook ad campaign. Let me go do another sales strategy. When in reality, we should be focusing on who that customer is, because this really doesn't work anymore. Okay? So we all feel pretty bad? Yeah? We all like want to go home and cry a little bit? That's okay. Okay, well how do we fix this, right? So normally I only get like 20, 30 minutes to speak, and that's where I end the entire presentation, and everyone kind of hates me, but we'll actually show you how to fix this. And what I want you to think about is think about the framework and think about the process. We're gonna go through a lot of different things, and I don't want you to get caught up on one little detail. We've written a free book on how to do all of this. None of this requires any money, it just requires effort. And you can also email me to get any of the details here. So again, focus on the process, focus on the framework. And the big thing here is, again, and I'm gonna bring this point home over and over again, stop building, stop buying ads, and start talking. And if you take nothing away from this presentation, nothing at all, Except this fact, it's really, really important. Go put a number on your whiteboard of people that you're going to talk to in a non-sales capacity about your products, about their needs and their wants, and just follow that particular number. And the best way to do that is through a framework like this. Sound good? All right, cool. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about buyer personas. So who knows what buyer personas are? Anyone? Okay. So a buyer persona is just a profile of your target customers. So if you're selling to someone like Tony here, who really cares about these particular things and is willing to pay this, then you know that profile of that buyer so that you can make decisions around your marketing, your sales, your product, all of these different things, hopefully before you've made major investments in your particular product. So these are extremely powerful, and the companies that are doing their customer development, they have some sort of measure of what are called quantified buyer personas, which is data to back up these different points. And we're gonna teach you how to actually build this today. And these can get much, much more complicated, but start small, just get the basics going. And this is what this process looks like. And I know this looks fancy and complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. What we're doing here is we're going out to your target customers, and it doesn't matter if they're moms and dads or if they're like big business people, it doesn't matter who it is, we're gonna go collect data from them through surveys or conversations. We're then gonna run that data through some basic statistical models. I know some of you might not be math nerds, that's okay. All of this is pretty basic math. We're gonna put together what is called that quantified buyer persona, and that's gonna help us make pricing decisions. This is the entire process in one slide, and I promise you this isn't complicated. It's just a process and a framework to use. So the first step is, let's talk about an example, and I already kind of alluded to this, but we're gonna talk about coffee. Who drinks coffee? Okay, so you all kind of drink coffee, you're familiar with coffee. Awesome. So we're gonna use this as an example just to make sure that we can all grasp what's going on. But this can be applied to software, hardware, enterprise software, enterprise anything, farm equipment, it can be applied to a lot of different things. So the first step is that what I want you to do is I want you to write down who you think the profile of your buyers are. So this doesn't have to be exact, but you know something about your buyers. You've been working in your space, even if it's for a month, so you know you're selling to soccer players, you know you're selling to moms at home, you know you're selling to students. You know something about those buyers, and just put a couple of profiles of who you think you're selling to. And these are particularly important because this starts to act as a fulcrum for how you can actually make these decisions. So for a cup of coffee, we might have blue collar Bob. This is like a hardworking, goes to the factory every day, uses his or her coffee just to like keep going. And then we might have hipster Henrietta. This is someone where he or she is just really into like fancy coffee. It's something that they're buying that's really, really important to them from a cultural perspective. So we can fill in what are the most valued features or the least valued features. So Bob might care about how much caffeine's in the coffee. Bob might care that it's hot, and then he might not care and probably doesn't care about the country of origin or some of these other factors. So we can get a really basic look at who Bob and Henrietta are. And the next step is we want to start collecting data so we can take all of those things that we hypothesize and validate or invalidate them. So there's three types of data you're going to collect. There's demographic data, there's relative preference data, and willingness to pay data, which ironically, asking someone what they're willing to pay is actually the easiest data to collect. But on the demographic side, what you're doing is you're using this purely for segmentation. So if you're selling to a B2C, like a consumer, you might ask about their gender, their household income, their location, their age, different things. If you're selling to a business, you might ask about annual revenue, team size, seniority, things like that. And the big demographic questions that you want to ask are anything that you think skews value. So if you think that a company or a person that has a higher seniority in a company is going to pay more than someone with a lower seniority, then you want to ask the seniority of the people you're going to ask questions of. If you think that a man is going to pay more or a woman is going to pay more for the thing that you're selling than the opposite gender, then you want to ask about gender. Normally, if you're selling to businesses, you don't ask these types of questions. And if you're selling to consumers, you don't really ask those types of questions. But what's interesting is that the other types of data that we're going to collect are that relative preference data and price sensitivity. And if you think back to that axis, those quadrants, the relative preference data is basically figuring out what attributes are really, really important to a customer, the taste, the color, the country of origin, and then willingness to pay is basically that price sensitivity. So the way that we're going to collect this are actually through surveys. So who here likes surveys? Who here does not like surveys? Okay, the reason you don't like surveys is because we are awful at sending surveys. We are just horrible as business people at sending surveys. We send 45 to 50 question surveys that we're not compensating the respondent on. And my personal favorite is I'll get emailed a survey that the first question is, what's your email address? And I just want to go, you just sent me the email. You know my email address, right? So the secret to doing really, really good research, especially through surveys, which are an amazing market research tool, is you have to respect the person who's going to answer the questions. And what that means is that your surveys, if they're not compensated, need to be less than really 60 to 180 seconds. That means you can really ask about 5 to maybe 7 questions. But what's really, really cool is that if you really respect the time of your particular respondent, you can send these surveys every 4 weeks, and you can get really consistent responses from your users and get really rapid research within your company. And so long story short, make sure you're sending surveys appropriately. We've sent 30 million of these things at this point. We know a thing or two about this. And there's a supplemental report I can send everyone about good survey design. But don't hate the surveys, hate the survey sender is like the big lesson here, okay? So how do we do good surveys? How do we get really, really good high impact questions? Well, remember that x-axis, right? What are the attributes that someone cares about? We're no longer going to ask questions like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you care about taste? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you care about X? Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take these different features and we're going to write down the categories. So for a particular B2C or coffee example, we might have a category of physical attributes. So these are the ones that I've been mentioning. We might also have a category of value propositions, right? Is it the best part of waking up? You know, hey, we're helping support developing countries with buying their coffee. What is that value prop that really we care about? Now, if you're a B2B company, you might have something a little bit more complicated. And so the secret here is you want to group different features together, and then we're going to ask them a really targeted question that I'm going to get to in a second. But in this particular example, let's imagine you have a really, really cool piece of hardware that has many, many different applications and tons of different features potentially. What you're going to end up doing is breaking those different features into categories and subcategories. And what that allows you to do is start to ask the right questions of your users. Now the format that we're going to use is something that looks like this. Of the following options, which is least and most important to you? Now the reason that this is so powerful is that you're forcing the respondent to make a decision. If you ask me on a scale of 1 to 10 how important his taste is, it's a 10. How important is country of origin? It's a 10. You're not forcing me to make a decision, you're just allowing me to say everything's important. But if you give me a question that looks like this, I have to make a decision. And what's really cool is that when you get this type of data and you translate it using some really, really basic math, you get results that look like this. So all of a sudden, I not only have magnitude, or excuse me, rank order, but I also have magnitude. So I know, for instance, that the taste of the coffee is 2 to 3 to 4x as important as some of these other features here. And when I start to break this down by different demographics, I can start to figure out, oh, this is interesting. The people who don't drink a lot of coffee, taste isn't really that important, and the people who drink a lot of coffee, taste isn't as important as people who drink kind of a medium amount of coffee. That's interesting, right? That's something you can make a decision on. Also, not a lot of people care about country of origin, except those people who drink very, very little amounts of coffee. That's also interesting. And when you make some assumptions about who your personas are, all of a sudden you can start to get a picture, oh, hipster Henrietta, he or she really cares about freshness and taste. Blue collar Bob, doesn't care as much, but also kind of cares about the temperature, which is kind of a weird thing to care about because all coffee is pretty much the same temperature, right? But all of a sudden, with one question, and you can imagine this as your features for your product, all of a sudden we have enough information to start making decisions. Okay, well, if we're gonna target Bob, it's gotta be fresh and have good taste, and we don't really need to care about the country of origin or the color. We don't really need to care about the color for any of these folks, and temperature, hipster, Henrietta doesn't really care about either. And what's fascinating is that we can then cross-reference this data with how much are people willing to pay for something. So this is like the magic question, and everyone expects some magic formula of how to measure willingness to pay. In actuality, it's super, super straightforward because we take advantage of a psychological phenomenon that's been studied for years. And that's the fact that human beings, we think about value as a spectrum. So what I mean by that is, we know that this bottle of water is worth less than a computer. And that's because we've purchased a computer, we know how much it costs, and we naturally know that this should be worth less than that computer, correct? And what's fascinating about this is that we can take advantage of that by asking ranged questions. So at what price point, and you can modify it if you're doing a subscription, or you can just do it straight up if you're doing some one-time purchase, at what price point is this way too expensive that you never consider purchasing it? At what price point is it becoming expensive, but you'd still consider purchasing it? At what price point is it a really, really good deal? And really, really important, especially if you're going in the Western market, at what price point is it too cheap that you question the quality of it? And when you take these data points and do some basic math, you get results that look like this. So that, at what price point is it way too expensive question, that's this far line over here. At what point is it too cheap? That's this far line over here. But what's really, really cool is this data point here. So this is known as a price elasticity curve. Who took economics here? Okay, for those of you who didn't take economics, what you're basically measuring is percent of sales lost across price point. So what we can actually do is we can say, okay, if we move our price here, how many people are we gonna lose? And maybe, is that gonna make up for revenue, right? Because we can theoretically sell to less people and make more money if our price point is high enough, right? Alternatively, if we wanna be, oh, and this got messed up here. We'll go back here. Alternatively, if we want to get as much of the market as possible, we want to be mass consumer, we might want to be here. And in reality, as you'll learn in kind of pricing 201 or 301, you might actually want a price point here, and a price point here, right? Because you're going to attack this whole side of the curve here. And that's when you're getting market dominance, when you're taking advantage of the entire part of the market. And for our coffee example, what's really interesting is you'll start to find results that look like this, that are very counterintuitive. Because I would expect if you're drinking a low amount of coffee, you might be willing to pay the most because you might really care about each cup. And then as you get down into lots of cups, you might actually go and want very, very good deals. But in reality, you have this little hump here, right? Where all of a sudden the people kind of in the middle who cared about country of origin, who cared about these different factors, all of a sudden they're actually willing to pay the most. And with some basic data, all of a sudden, we now know what Bob cares about. We know how much Bob's willing to pay. We know what Henrietta cares about. We know what Henrietta's willing to pay. And then if we take some basic math and some basic assumptions, we can figure out what do we expect the lifetime value of that customer to look like, and what's that customer acquisition cost going to look like. And just with this one slide and these data points, I can figure out, oh my gosh, Bob's a really bad customer. I thought he was gonna be brilliant. I thought he was gonna be the guy who was gonna make me millions. In reality, he's just really bad. He costs me way too much for the amount of money that I'm able to get out of him. Whereas Henrietta, she's just willing to open up the wallet and give us all the money, right? For the amount of money that she actually costs to acquire. And this is the type of research that Peter was talking about. It's so important because if you put together your crowdfunding campaign, if you get all your logistics figured out, everything figured out, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, we got a bunch of Bobs, That's a really, really bad business decision to make, especially if you're bootstrapped or don't have a lot of money in terms of your company. So when we bring this all together, what we can do is we can do some other types of analyses as well, and go back to our little 2x2 here. And I kind of already used this example in particular, but we start to figure out what are the big things that we should care about and what are the big things that we shouldn't care about. So if I'm building a coffee company in this particular case, I know that temperature is just like table stakes, as we talked about before. Temperature of the coffee's got to be good. The color, I don't have to care about. The color, no one cares about. They're not willing to pay more for it. But now I have an interesting decision, right? I can build something that has really, really good stories around the country of origin, right? For basically the hipsters out there who really, really care about where their coffee comes from, right? I can build a coffee line that caters to that particular individual, and I can also build one that caters just to the taste, right? That's where I can get some differentiation. And this is where, when you're setting up your pricing, and this looks like a very software example, obviously, you want to use these personas to basically earn your paycheck as founders, executives, and people building product, and actually make the right decisions around who you should target, and more often than not, who you shouldn't target. I can't tell you the number of times that we've helped a company that's doing $50, $100 million in revenue, and they've built their entire business on the wrong type of buyer. And when they're trying to go out, raise money, trying to go public, all of a sudden they realize the entire DNA of their company is geared towards these customers, and they have to change everything, which is very, very expensive and almost impossible to do to go after those right customers. So make sure you're really, really focusing on this customer development. And if you've never done this before, that's okay. Start small. You can always test more. It's not like you have to go, as they say, boil the ocean or just do everything at once. Start with one question, one data point, one persona, and then build over time as you continue to build your company. So with that, happy to answer any questions. Here's my email address. More than happy to send these materials over. Like I said, we wrote a book on this. Yeah, more than happy to help. Do we have some time for questions? Maybe? Yeah. Awesome.
Is there any questions?
Usually startup like us who's really small is that we have a very limited resources and things like that. How can we do something like this? And also, for us, always frequently asked question by investors and people is like, when are you going to scale up? But when we are going to scale up, we have to do something like that. How can we do it?
Yeah. So the truth is that you should do this before you scale, because this is going to help you scale in a very, very efficient way. And the way that you can do this, and I glossed over it in the presentation, but finding people to answer these types of questions is a lot cheaper than you think. So for one, you can go out and you can hustle, right? You can find your customers, you can walk down the street and find who you're actually targeting. But the other secret is that there are companies, there's an entire industry out there that are called market panelist companies. Anyone hear of Amazon Mechanical Turk before? Okay, disregard that then. But there are entire companies out there where their entire goal is you can pay for people to take surveys. And you can pay for anyone from a soccer mom or dad in the middle of Kansas all the way to a Fortune 500 CIO in Hong Kong here. They cost very different amounts of money. But when we were building ourselves a new product, we did very, very example research like this. It cost us $2,000, 2,000 US dollars. And it took us about 20 hours to do total. So there's no excuse for not doing this research. There's a couple of resources. One is called Ask Your Target Market, aytm.com. You could literally go on there today, especially if you're a consumer product, and you could get answers by the end of the day today, by midnight tonight. It's that easy to get those respondents. And most consumer panelists, you're going to go between 50 cents, 50 US cents to about $2 per response. It can get more expensive as you segment, but it's not that expensive of a task, because keep in mind, you're hedging against making probably $1,000 mistakes, if not tens of thousands or $100,000 mistakes here. It's a great question though. Thanks for asking it, because I did forget to mention that. Thanks.
Any more?
You guys are all masters? You all got it now? Everything's figured out? I think it's on. I think it should be good.
It's on?
Yeah.
I would like to thank you for this useful information. Actually, I'm thinking of starting a new project, and it was quite useful. So
Good.
I would like to send you an email
Sure.
for more.
Absolutely. More than happy to help.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, we got one. I could do this all day too, so.
Hi, Patrick. Your
Yeah.
presentation is awesome. But just a question for those thousands companies you work on. Where do they base major?
One more time, sorry.
In which area they based?
Which area is who based?
I mean the distribution, the proportion in north hemisphere or south hemisphere, or
For the respondents?
for your research data.
For our research?
Yeah.
Our research is actually global. So we have all of the data you saw in the first half of the presentation. It's pretty balanced. Now it does skew a bit to Europe and the US, but we have users and we have a free product, so that allowed us to really scale globally. So it's pretty proportionate across the globe. Yeah, I would say if we did have to segment out Asia versus the rest of the world, it's actually probably worse in a couple of areas, mainly because of just the volume of people. So distribution gets a little bit harder with that much volume, ironically, even though there's more people.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, Patrick, thank you. So, actually, if we have some product and we want your help with the evaluation, what would be the right price, for example, for entering US market? So the question is, what kind of data we should collect before actually talking to you, so we are ready to supply that? So, you can talk to me whenever, because we've written a lot on this stuff, so we probably have some resources to help you. But typically what we find is if you're just starting out, just get a really basic level of, a basic level of what willingness to pay is for your product, right? And you might not have the product yet, you just have an idea, but find a group of 100 people, either qualitatively or quantitatively through surveys, where you can get willingness to pay data on whatever product you're thinking of building. Because it won't necessarily be precise, but you'll start to see at least the range of the product. So one of the slides in the previous presentation, looking at if it's 0 to 50, Vietnam and a couple of others are really good locations, 50 to 150, these locations, 150 plus other locations, it starts to give you that data, and it's very, very cheap in terms of time and resources to get that information. And then the next step would be, depending on if you're trying to find a market, is then start collecting that data on a market by market basis. And I wouldn't go to, Hong Kong versus China versus, close locations. I would try to find like the US versus South America versus Asia, because that's gonna start to figure out where, well, it's interesting, like we're not based in Argentina, but Argentina is actually willing to pay 3x for what we're trying to build. And if you have some good distribution techniques, it actually is super helpful. So that's where I would start, at a very, very high level, and then start to think about some of the other questions as well. Cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. You had the graph with the price points, what people are willing to pay for features or for non-features.
Yep.
When you start polling or when you start putting questionnaires out, how do you get honest replies, or people just filling it in just because to get past the questions?
So it's incredibly fascinating how people are more honest than you think they're going to be. And so what I mean by that is, remember, we're not just asking 3 people, right? We're asking 100 people. Like, that should be your target, especially if you're a consumer product. Should not be hard. If it's hard to get 100 people to answer a survey, it's gonna be hard to get 100 people to buy the product, right? And so what's interesting is that there's 2 things that help with honesty and bias. One is the survey design. So what I mean by that is you're not asking a point blank question, right? You're asking in ranges, or you're asking in a forced decision environment. And
what that allows you to do is you can actually, you might not get necessarily the precise price, but you start to figure out kind of the range of where your product is going to be, right? The second thing is that outlier analysis is definitely going to happen, right? So if everyone out of that 100 says $80, let's say, the one guy or gal who said $1, you're just not going to count their data, right? And so that's really, really important point, is to make sure you clean your data, but the questions actually account for a lot of that survey bias in order to kind of help get the right information. Yeah, good question.
Any more?
Great. Well, I'm around, so if you have any questions, here's my email address. We're based in Boston in the States. I literally just got here this morning and I'm sick, so sorry if I seem like a sweaty mess up here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for a useful speech.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.